Good evening. Hi, I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to LOA Live. Library of America is a nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the multivocal democratic spirit of our literary tradition a vital part of the culture. A special welcome to Library of America fellows and members who support our nonprofit mission. 2023 continues Library of America's 40th anniversary celebrations, which we're marking with events like this one. Please check our website, loa.org, for updates. Tonight's program explores one of the most popular works ever written about the Civil War, Bruce Catton's Army of the Potomac Trilogy, a masterpiece of historical storytelling and scholarship, now restored to print, and a one-volume Library of America edition edited by Gary Gallagher, who joins us tonight. A link to the book will be dropped into the chat. Special thanks to our promotional partners for this program: the American Historical Association, the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers, the National Council of History Education, and the University of Virginia. Bruce Catton grew up in a small town in Northwest Michigan, listening to Union veterans tell stories about the Civil War. In his three great works of the early 1950s, Mr. Lincoln's Army, Glory Road, and the Pulitzer Prize-winning A Stillness at Appomattox, he would do more to convey the experience of the ordinary soldiers whose sacrifice preserved the nation than any writer or historian before him, transforming Civil War history in the process. It is good to remember, Catton said about history conceived as the play of large, irresistible forces, that it is people who make the pattern and not the other way around. What inspired Catton's democratic focus on the war's rank and file? And how did it change the way we understand the conflict? What did he mean by calling the war a tragedy and remarking in a Memorial Day speech, tragedy is not quite in key in the American spirit? How does Catton's work help us wrestle with the ultimate meaning of the Civil War? What makes the trilogy a classic? And how have the 7 decades since its first publication, in the midst of the Cold War, and as the civil rights movement began to take hold in a divided and turbulent South, changed the way we read it? To explore these questions, we're incredibly lucky to be joined by 2 distinguished historians. Gary Gallagher, editor of the LOA Catton edition, is John L. Nowell III Professor in the History of the American Civil War Emeritus at the University of Virginia. His many books include The Union War and Becoming Confederates, Paths to a New National Loyalty. As a public historian, he has taken part in more than a dozen television projects. He joins us from Los Angeles. Harold Holzer, Jonathan F. Fanton Director at Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College, and a prolific lecturer and television commentator, has authored, co-authored, or edited 55 books on Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War era, and American political culture. Most recently, The President versus the Press, the endless battle between the White House and the media, from the Founding Fathers to fake news. For Library of America, he has edited the Lincoln Anthology, Great Writers on His Life and Legacy, and President Lincoln Assassinated, the firsthand story of the murder, manhunt, trial, and mourning. He joins us from Roosevelt House in Midtown Manhattan. We invite your questions and comments. The Q&A button is on your menu bar. Please let us know where you're viewing from. And now, please welcome Gary Gallagher and Harold Holzer.
Thank you, Max. Thank you for that terrific introduction. And thanks to the Library of America for convening this discussion. And what a pleasure to see my friend Gary Gallagher through what we used to call the magic of Zoom, but I guess has become so commonplace, second nature to us. As Max said, I'm in New York, Gary is LA, so there is an element of magic here, at least in time zones. Welcome, Gary, and welcome to all of you viewers in between New York.
And I'll say welcome back, Harold and Max. Thanks for that wonderful introduction.
So Gary, let me start with a kind of impressionistic question, because we're both around the same age, even though we have different backgrounds and grew up in different parts of the country. Yet both of us were hypnotized in a way and lured into Civil War and into the Civil War field in large part by Bruce Catton. So what do you think was the mystery or the mastery or the combination of both that proved so impactful to two preteens from different parts of the country?
Preteens, yes. I was either 10 or 11 when I was first introduced to Catton, and I came to him first via his text in the American Heritage Picture History of the Civil War, which was a wonderful book published in 1960. Tremendously successful book, sold very well, reached a very wide audience. What captured me from the beginning, I think, by Catton, well, the reason Catton appealed to me was that he just wrote so evocatively and so well. He had the ability to pull me, even as a 10 or 11-year-old, into another century and into the midst of great events that absolutely captivated me and started me on a road that I've never gotten off. I mean, Catton, to a significant degree, is responsible for my making my life as an academic and a lecturer and writer who deals with the era of the Civil War.
One of his achievements, at least in terms of influence of kids and adults, I think, was making us, I know I've heard you talk about this, and it's the same for me, making us want to visit the places he wrote about. Tell us about some of the journeys that you went on with your folks, because heaven knows I've seen the pictures that you've been sending throughout the pandemic on the Facebook of your excursions.
When you said we grew up in different places, we really did. I mean, you grew up in New York. Right. And I grew up on a farm in southern Colorado, having moved there as a very young boy from Los Angeles. Catton, I had been reading Catton about 4 years when my mother and grandmother and I got into a car and drove from Alamosa, Colorado to Gettysburg and back and visited various sites along the way. And I had the American Heritage Picture History of the Civil War with me and the Army of the Potomac Trilogy. And I would get the books out and return to passages that had been so important to me as I stood on the ground and looked at Little Round Top or looked at Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge. As a Colorado, and I was sort of disappointed in how small the ridges were in Pennsylvania. I had in mind
not compared to Queens, New York. They were big.
But that was one of the really wonderful parts of having read Catton, is that I had in my mind some sense of these places, but to be able actually to go to the places and look at them and then think about what I had read was really transformative for me.
Yeah, I took the same road trip, albeit from a shorter distance, and we hit Gettysburg and Washington, D.C. when I was 12, which I'll never forget. I didn't bring a book with me. I brought my father.
I was 14, so I was a little bit older than you. Went to Antietam, went to Gettysburg. We went to the places that are at the heart, many of the key places that are at the heart of the Army of the Potomac Trilogy.
So very quickly, because I want to move on, I have so many things to ask you. How did the realization of these places, now they were more commercial when we were kids. They've been restored.
Yes, yes.
Beautifully, but how did they stack up to the descriptions? Could you find the places that Catton described?
I could, of course I could. And I'll use Gettysburg as an example again, because it lays out, there it is. Yes, I did find the peach orchard, and there were peach trees in it. And there was Little Round Top, and there was the stone wall on Cemetery Ridge. The places were there. It made tangible, more understandable things that I had been reading about. I didn't go, this is this is sort of off the topic just a little bit. One thing I didn't do was think a lot about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain at Gettysburg, because Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain isn't a big figure in Bruce Catton's books, and wasn't a big figure in the understanding of the Civil War when you and I were boys.
Right.
The fact that he came to the forefront has a lot to do with the power of popular culture through novels and films. But that's one thing retrospectively that I've thought about. The hero of Little Round Top was Gouverneur Warren, not Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain in 1965.
Yeah. So going back to the early days, you mentioned that Catton inspired you to pursue your many avenues of approach to the Civil War, by which I don't mean Route 66 when you went to Gettysburg, but your work in the media, in lecturing, and in academia. So in the day, how was Bruce Catton treated by the academic community? Here was a guy who was out selling all of them put together, probably. Was there resistance or resentment to a non-academic making such an impact? And how was he treated by his peers?
I think the way that most academics treated Bruce Catton was by ignoring him. That is how, with an occasional barb about popular history and how popular history wasn't very good history. And I think a lot of people said that about Catton who actually hadn't read Catton. But Bruce Catton was in a different world, as you say. I mean, untold people read his works. Mm-hmm. The kind of readership that almost I would say no academic achieves. I mean, they just don't. And there's always a small undercurrent of resentment, I think, in the academic world about those popular writers, and popular is a pejorative in the academic world in this regard. Popular writers who write the books that get reviewed and people read, as opposed to the real history that academics write. So I would say the main relationship between Catton and the academic world that I grew up in and then lived most of my life in is that he was simply not part of it.
Let's talk a little bit about a subject that Max mentioned in his introduction, and that's, I mean, we've confided our personal attraction to Catton and the period. What about Catton? More about his background. What do we know about that inspired him? His student days, his reading.
Yeah, I think the key, I think it's very obvious. He talked about it many times. He remembered, he grew up he was born around the turn of the century in Michigan, and he grew up surrounded by veterans of the Civil War, Union veterans of the Civil War. And he and his pals viewed them as a sort of heroic generation who had actually been at the places that were so famous to those young boys. They'd been at Shiloh, they'd been at Gettysburg, they'd been at Chickamauga and at Chancellorsville. There they were, Cold Harbor. They had actually been there, and they simply occupied a distinct and very much admired position during his boyhood in Michigan. And I think that as he got older, he made his career as a journalist for the most part. I think, as almost all of our listeners probably know, when he did begin to return to the Civil War, he did so centered on those veterans. It was the veterans that brought him back, the common soldiers of the Civil War, who really exerted the pull on Catton toward the mid-19th century. And he had that tangible tie to the war through those veterans. He was close to the war.
Yeah.
He was close to the war in the way that when you and I were young, there were many, many, many World War I veterans around. We could talk to World War I veterans. There they were. They were the older guys when we were growing up. Well, the Civil War soldiers were to Catton what the World War I soldiers were to us.
And perhaps what the World War II survivors are to teenagers today, if they
or even people in their 20s and 30s now. Yeah. Yes, that's right.
You mentioned briefly his work as a journalist and but let's talk a little bit about that, because his background, I mean, it always inspirited me because he was a journalist and a government PR guy. I mean, what could be a more perfect approach for me to take to Lincoln and the Civil War than replicating that trajectory? Exactly. Tell us about some of the jobs he had. before he turned?
Well, he worked as a newspaperman in Ohio and in Massachusetts, in Cleveland, and then in Boston. But then he ended up in Washington, and spent a good deal of his journalistic career in Washington through the 30s. Before, during the war, going into government work, as you mentioned, and working with the War Production Board, and had other positions during the war. He had a close-up view of problems of supply and procurement and allocation of resources and so forth during World War II. The debates about that, the interdepartmental squabbling about that, the maneuvering about that, that I think very much informed his work about the Army of the Potomac and the political military interactions characteristic of the Army of the Potomac that shows so well in his Army of the Potomac trilogy.
I know, that's a really good
World War II experience there.
I should have called out the terrific phrase you picked up and used in your introduction, which, by the way, I will recommend to everyone on the Zoom who may not yet have secured the volume, that your introduction alone is worth the price of admission, to coin a cliche. And you mentioned that he regarded his childhood home as kind of the flower bed of Civil War knowledge, and that he watered it, he fertilized it.
He did.
It's an
Yep.
unfortunate use of the term.
He,
In the same way, Gary, that Sandberg gleaned so much from the people in Galesburg that he encountered, who had met Abraham Lincoln.
no,
Another
very,
problem.
very much so. I think that a writer that Catton certainly had in mind as he wrote his Army of the Potomac trilogy was Douglas Southall Freeman, who had written a Virginian, a Richmonder. He spent most of his life in Richmond as an editor, a newspaper editor, although he had a PhD in history. But he had written a 4-volume biography of Robert E. Lee, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and then wrote 3 volumes on the Army in Northern Virginia's high command called Lee's Lieutenants. And I think part of what Catton was doing was trying to sort of do for the most famous United States Army, Union Army during the war, what Freeman had done very successfully for the most famous Confederate Army in Lee's Lieutenants. I think there's a sense of sort of bringing readers the other side of the story there. Freeman's books had been widely praised and widely read. Scribner's published them. And I think Catton admired Freeman as a historian, talked about how Freeman also wrote about common soldiers. I think that was part. Catton's a Union man. I mean, his war is the Union War. That's who he is. And I think part of what he was doing was sort of responding to Freeman's very successful evoking of the leadership and culture of the Army in Northern Virginia in Lee's Lieutenants.
Not to obsess about this point, because I find it of interest. I hope other people do as well. Most of Freeman is sort of a top-down book about the high command. Do you think Catton thought about that approach and decided to do a more bottom-up look?
He never said exactly why he took the approach he did, although he certainly got at it in a little preface that he added to a 1960s reprint of the trilogy. He says it's about his whole project really was to recapture the world and the service and the attitudes and the experiences of the common soldiers in the Army of the Potomac. I don't think he ever came at this. I don't think his original idea was, I'm going to write about all these famous generals and maybe do something on the common soldiers. I think the common soldiers were always at the center of his project. Although having said that, he's absolutely brilliant at short form portraiture of the commanders and other leaders of the army. He's brilliant at it. He gets at the essence of these people in an economy of words that's really quite amazing, and I think hits bullseyes most of the time in how he assesses them.
You're right. Savvy assessments, but also economic prose. I think that's the journalist in him and the press release writer.
I don't think there's any question. I mean, he gets McClellan, and he understands all McClellan's strengths, but he says, why was it so important for him to have people tell him he was wonderful? There's a great hole at the center of McClellan that he tries to fill by constantly talking about how much people like him and how wonderful he is and how he's going to save the Union. And you often wonder how his wife stood to read this barrage of letters that she
Yeah.
got from little Jorge. But I think that Catton really understood McClellan, and I think he conveys the essence of McClellan in very few words in Mr. Lincoln's Army.
Yeah, I emphatically agree. Those capsule portraits are brilliant all throughout the trilogy. Just to help our audience through a little bit of the trajectory of Catton, did he ever write a book on any subject other than the Civil War?
Yes, he did. His first book was a book called The Warlords of Washington, where he wrote about that draws on his World War II experience and on the kind of bureaucratic World War II. That came out in 1948. Didn't sell very well, but it was. He decided in the wake of that book that he was going to quit being a journalist and become a writer. It really is a leap of faith on his part to decide he can make his living as a writer. First two volumes of the Army of the Potomac Trilogy did not sell very well. The third one wasn't selling that well. When it won the Pulitzer Prize, the world changed, and then it began to sell well. Then they all began to sell well. And then the book clubs, I mean, my mother got my set of the Army of the Potomac Trilogy as a bonus from the Book of the Month Club. That's how I got it from a book club.
Yeah. So he never moonlit on the Civil War. He didn't work weekends as I did for so many years. But
I think that he did. I think that he was sort of working on it as an aside, collecting information, reading. He was one of the first historians to pay serious attention to regimental histories. That is, histories written by and for members of the Union regiments. Those can be problematical sources, as all can, but they also have just a wonderful array of information in them. He was one of the first to really appreciate those. Yeah. And he's a writer. He didn't go do the kind of manuscript work that most academic historians would work. He didn't go immerse himself in unpublished sources. He used the array of available published materials as of the late 1940s, 1950, 51, to write these books, including, of course, the official records of the War of the Rebellion, the 128 volumes of primary material that the War Department published between the late 1880s and 1901.
And no internet to do word
searches.
Internet.
No
word searches.
No.
I don't know how any of us functioned in that. We did.
And he later used research assistants. He didn't use research assistants in any systematic way for the Army of the Potomac Trilogy either. Later, when he was a more notable figure, when he wrote another 3-volume history, the Centennial History of the Civil War, he had a research assistant named E.B. Long, who was an indefatigable researcher who visited untold manuscript collections and sent materials to Catton. That was not the case when he wrote the Army of the Potomac Trilogy.
Well, Long did pretty well. He managed to do his own book that's still a classic. So
Long did very well. His Civil War Day by Day is always within reach of me in my library.
Me as well, not in my office, but at home for sure.
Yep.
So taking Catton one more step, he does spend time as, I don't remember whether he was founding editor, but one of the early editors, at least, of American Heritage magazine, where he creates several legends in his own time as an editor, as a man of a very unusual and demanding routine. Talk a little bit about Catton, the editor, and what he contributes to building interest in the Civil War through American Heritage.
Well, Catton not only helped to build popular interest in the American Civil War, I think he's without question the most read historian who's written about the Civil War from the mid-20th century down to the present. I don't think there's any question about that. But he had a larger vision than that, as did Allen Nevins, another former newspaper man who ended up as an academic, taught at Columbia for a long time and wrote a number of very large books. They had a notion of publishing a really well-written and kind of serious historical magazine for a general reading public, not for academics. And the result was the magazine called American Heritage. I got it as a boy. It was a hardcover.
Remember those days?
6 times a year with white covers and beautiful color, then illustrations on the front board. He was the first editor of that, and then later, and he was associated with that for its entire formative and kind of the heyday of its life. Catton is right at the center of that, and did become. He was very, very. He was known as just a superb editor. You could give him something, he'd make it better. He's one of. I mean, it's. He was once asked what the key to good writing is, and he said the key to good writing is clarity. He said if you don't write clearly, nothing else matters. If you do write clearly, then you have a good chance of really writing well. And I think that his years as a journalist and then his years as an editor at American Heritage helped develop and then let him pass those strengths along to others. But at he was a giant at American Heritage. And others who wrote very well about the war, including Stephen W. Sears, who's one of our best narrative historians of the military side of the war, as a very young man, worked under Catton at American Heritage and learned a lot from him.
And we've all heard stories about his liquid lunches, and that's the way he did
one
his.
One of those guys who, yes, that generation,
No.
he smoked, he drank, and still got a lot done.
Exactly. I wish I could figure it out. But so the books you've edited for the LOA collection, which is beautiful. Mr. Lincoln's Army, Glory Road, and Stillness. Is it true they took Catton 3 or so years to produce those books?
Yes, they did. They came out one a year over a space of 3 years, and he
How
spent
is
about
that
a year and a half
even-
on them before that.
How is that even possible? I mean, just think
Well, it's I think his many years as a journalist, I think he understood deadlines. Everybody talked about that. He understood deadlines. He worked efficiently. They total more than 1,000 pages, the 3 books. They're not heavily annotated. He has notes in them, but the end notes in them, but not the kind of overwhelming citations that many scholarly books would have. I think he just worked efficiently, and there are surprises in them. I mean, when I came back to edit these, I hadn't read them in a long time. A long time. And I came back to them, and there were several surprises for me. And one was that my boyhood sense of them was that they're pretty much a lot of stuff about battles and action in them. There actually isn't that much about battles and action in them. I mean, the battles are there. They're set piece descriptions that he has. But he does a great deal more in these books than they're not just a military narrative. They are much, much more than that. And it's not strict chronology. He doesn't begin with the beginning of the story in Mr. Lincoln's Army. He begins with John Pope and the campaign of Second Bull Run in Mr. Lincoln's Army. And then he drops back and brings McClellan on the scene and so forth. There were a number of surprises in them when I came.
that beginning is very artful, surprisingly artful.
Very artful.
I did not remember that until I saw the Library of America.
I didn't either. And he also does surprising things with key moments. There, at the end of A Stillness at Appomattox, there you are at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, 1865. And here comes Grant in his little cavalcade riding toward the McLean house. And you think, okay, now he's going to take us in. He doesn't take us into the McLean house. You're with the common soldiers. You see Grant ride by. That's the end of that. And then the band strike up Old Lang Syne. I mean, what a way to end that book. Completely unexpected.
And by the way, nobody feels cheated or felt cheated by that.
No. But this does the same thing with Lincoln at Gettysburg. He sets the stage, and then he says the tall man, I'll just paraphrase, stood up. He has 2 pages of notes in his hands, and he began to speak. That's the end of the volume. Not a word from the Gettysburg Address.
And it works.
It works beautifully.
Do you have anything you were going to read for us from? I know you were thinking of setting aside a passage or 2 that you would read.
I actually didn't come prepared to read those passages. I have a couple that I will mention if
Sure.
And if you want to just fill time for a minute, I can grab the book and find the passages. But I didn't come prepared.
Well, you did a good paraphrase with the Gettysburg Address. What else strikes you as this kind of surprising?
Well, I just think that he's very good at he's very good at a number of things. I think occasionally he tries too hard, but it doesn't happen very often. For the most part, you often find yourself, or I often found myself, stopping after a sentence and just saying, what made him think of saying that way? It's perfect. It's absolutely perfect. It works in a way that no other way of writing it would work as well. But what made him think of doing it that way? Again and again, I found myself thinking that. I also, and I'll go ahead and admit this, that over the years, there are a number of phrases and scenes and things that I've used in teaching, in giving battlefield tours, in lecturing, that I found almost verbatim in Bruce Catton. I've been absolutely cribbing from him my whole life and wasn't even aware of it. They had made such an imprint on my young mind. They just became part of my understanding of the war. I've used them, never attributed them because I never even thought of them as really coming directly from Catton, but they did.
You absorbed.
Just absorbed them. I did. I think that he is, when he wants to do a set piece on a battlefield, he's just, one of my favorites is how he brings the Iron Brigade onto the scene of battle on July the 1st, 1863. Talks a lot about the Iron Brigade. The Iron Brigade forms a sort of leitmotif through the book because it's an all-Western regiment, Western in Civil War. That is Wisconsin and Indiana and Michigan. There's one regiment from Michigan there. And they wore distinctive hats, and they're the most famous brigade in the Army, and they're the 1st Brigade of the 1st Division of the 1st Army Corps. So, and he has them going toward that, how they thought if the Army were ever drawn up in one long line, they would come first. But as he brings them onto the field, he just paints this picture. He pulls readers into what they can see and what they can hear. He talks about the music that the bands start to play, and how to the west they can hear the battle developing, and a soiled cloud of musket smoke drifts up. And he talks about how the bands are playing. They're probably playing "The Girl I Left Behind Me," the perennial theme song, he calls it, of the Army of the Potomac. And then he finishes by saying, playing the Iron Brigade into its last great fight. Well, what we learn later in the chapter is there are 1,800 men in the Iron Brigade when they wake up on the morning of July 1st, and 1,200 of them become casualties that day. It's the end of the Iron Brigade as a great unit in the Army of the Potomac. The way he brings the Iron Brigade onto that field is just amazing to me. Every time I read it, it just is, it's a powerful, powerful passage.
So these books are 65 or so years old.
They are.
Senior citizens in history. How do they hold up in terms of all of the additional resources and attitudes we have all brought to the study over the last 25 years, let's say?
Of course, in some ways, they're products of their time. He talks about, he uses the words Negro, and he talks about colored troops, which would have been the acceptable language of 1948, 49, 50, 51, 52. But he quite surprisingly anticipated a number of turns that the scholarship would actually take. When he was writing, there was really only one historian who'd written seriously about common soldiers, and that was Bell Wiley, who'd written a book called The Life of Johnny Reb that came out in the mid-1940s. And after Catton, he would publish The Life of Billy Yank on Union soldiers. He is generally acknowledged as the pioneer in common soldier studies. I would complicate that by saying Bruce Catton really should get credit for being at least the co-anticipator of that part of the field, because Catton did exactly the same thing in these books, writing from the ranks, looking outward and upward, only he reached far more readers than Bell Wiley did. So in terms of really influencing people to come at the war instead of from a top-down way, most of the literature before Catton had dealt with high politics or with great commanders and their military campaigns with some attention to diplomacy and so forth, all from the top down. Catton really changed that frame of reference from one down, from the command into the ranks, from one in the ranks outward and up. I think he should get credit for that. He also says in these books, and I hadn't remembered this either, that this Civil War isn't really primarily a military event. It's primarily a political event. It's a political event that is resolved through military means. And part of that political event is the question of emancipation. He talks about emancipation. He talks about attitudes toward Black people and emancipation on the part of the soldiers in the ranks and others. He really does much more of that than I think most military history at the time would have done. So he anticipates that change in the literature as well. He talks about what we would now call the dark turn. He talks about cowardice. He talks about plundering. He uses the Battle of Fredericksburg really to talk about how this war had changed from 1861 to December 1862, and how it has reached a point where you really hate the other side, and where you think anything you do to the other side is all right because the other side has proved to be so vile. He does a lot of things that are sort of surprising for someone who was writing 65 years ago. On the other hand, he wrote before the explosion of gender studies or of memory studies or of the real attention to emancipation in Black people. So if someone coming at the books now is expecting as much of those kinds of things as they would find in a current book, they're not going to find that. It's 65 years ago. It's a different world. But
on the other hand, it occurred to me when you were talking about his pioneering work on the common soldier that the reigning Lincoln Prize laureate, Carrie Janey, your colleague, your one-time colleague at UVA, has written a book about Appomattox and the aftermath that doesn't have much to do with Ulysses S. Grant or Robert E. Lee, and is a brilliant look at the common soldiers and what they did after allegedly peace and harmony was restored.
Absolutely. She really complicates that notion of now let's just all be friends at Appomattox.
A little bit of Catton influence. I don't know if she'd agree, but is Catton, one of his geniuses, the ability to cast a wide lens and a focused lens on these incidents that he always has?
Absolutely. And he's brilliant at evoking the politics of the Army of the Potomac. I mean, the Army of the Potomac is only a few dozen miles from Washington, D.C. for much of its life. No other army was as politicized in the United States, or in the Confederacy for that matter, as the Army of the Potomac. And he is really good at drawing that out, as well as drawing out both the political notions and actions of officers in the Army, and the ways in which members of Congress and others interfered with, tried to shape what the Army was doing.
I think he may be one of the first to write about Black troops, actually, in a white writer's account of.
I think the first white writer to write a book about Black troops was Dudley Cornish, and the Sable Arm, and Dudley Cornish's book came out a number of years after the Army of the Potomac trilogy.
Did Catton ever? When he talked about Lee, and I know in the Army of the Potomac trilogy, he sees Lee as, of course, the adversary.
Yeah.
And doesn't do a Freeman job on him as the knight of the cause, or the lost cause. Does he ever comment on Lee? Does he ever find fault? Does he ever find virtue in Lee?
I think
he's been dissected so much now.
I think his take on Lee is that Lee is a very good soldier, but more than that, a kind of worthy opponent for the Army of the Potomac. I think he's even-handed in his treatment of Confederates, but there's no question about. I mean, his heart lies with the soldiers who had blue uniforms on. There's absolutely no question about that. He doesn't take time to sort of demonize Confederates in the books. He treats them, as I said, as an able and very effective opponent to the Army of the Potomac. But there's no question about sort of which side he's on. He's on the side of the United States soldiers in the Army of the Potomac.
So I know this is not exactly on topic, but who knows? You may have to do this as your next volume for the Library of America. Not that I would dare to influence their selection process, but what about his centennial books? Coming Fury and Terrible Swift Sword, Never Call Retreat. How did he avoid rehashing the things that he began in the 1950s?
Well, those books,
aside from broadening his reach to the Western theater,
really broadened his reach.
Yeah.
And the first volume of that, The Coming Fury, is really about. I mean, it deals with First Bull Run, but it's mainly about the coming of the war, and that is dealt with only obliquely in the Army of the Potomac trilogy. So it's a very different kind of history. My personal preference is I think the Army of the Potomac trilogy is better than the Centennial History of the Civil War. If I were only going to read one, I would read the Army of the Potomac trilogy. The next thing by Catton that I would read would be his 2 books on U.S. Grant. He finished the work that Lloyd Lewis had begun with Captain Sam Grant in 1950. Lewis died, and then Catton did Grant Moves South and Grant Takes Command. He also got Grant. They're both Midwesterners, and I think he really did get Grant. His 2 books on Grant are absolutely still worth reading. He also wrote a very brief book called U.S. Grant and the American Military Tradition, which came out in 1954. It came out before the books, the Grant, the 2 big Grant books came out later. He wrote this shorter one, also worth reading, in 1954, U.S. Grant and the American Military Tradition.
And what is it about what I hope our viewers don't think is a children's book, but what is it about the American heritage picture history of the Civil War, which meant so much to me in terms of developing my interest in iconography and art, but was just so brilliantly done.
Well, and that's part of it, Harold. It's the entire package, and it was reprinted. They brought it back and reprinted it with a new introduction by Jim McPherson in the 1990s. And Jim's introduction is good, as you would imagine. But if I were going to give somebody one or the other of the books, I'd give them the original one. It's a combination. It's a fascinating combination of paintings, the black and white photographs, and contemporary, that is late 1950s photographs of places and battlefields, together with David Greenspan's amazing bird's eye maps.
Yeah, the maps were something.
Which just, I can't tell you how much time I spent looking at those as a boy, and I've never seen anything else like them anywhere else. It was just this combination of those things together with Catton's really wonderful, very fluid and very smooth text that made that book it was a phenomenon at the time. It's still a book that I often recommend to people as something to look at to give to someone who maybe is interested in an overview of the Civil War. It's dated in many ways, of course, but it's just there's something about it. It's an amazing book. Amazing.
You know, I used to know the Lincoln historian Stephen Laurent, who wrote a book called Lincoln, A Picture Story of His Life, not a children's book, describing to me once the art of writing sidebars, essentially. And that's what Catton had down. Then he brought his magazine, his journalistic days, all together, including his vast knowledge, but to winnow it down like that is just an extraordinary gift.
And I want to emphasize what you've already said. The American Heritage Picture History of the Civil War is not a children's book. It is not a children's book. But it works with children.
It does. I have one. I think I'm going to have time for one more question because I hear the signals coming that the Q&A will be open, and we have lots of questions out there. So here's a speculation. I know how you love counterfactual history, so I will. Without Bruce Catton, there would not have been Ken Burns. I think Ken Burns is a level that takes Catton and obviously makes the pictures move. I don't think there's an efflorescence of Civil War scholarship that occurred through 2015. And I know you're a Catton fan and you're going to agree.
No, I actually agree with that. There's no way to prove it, but I know that the people who fueled much of the battlefield preservation movement, for example, grew up with Catton. The Civil War really exploded in the 80s and then through the 90s for a variety of reasons. Ken Burns was part of that. Jim McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom was part of that. There were the 125th anniversaries. What else gets remembered on its 125th anniversary? I don't even think there's a word for that. All of those, I think, were heavily dependent on people who had been, at least to a degree, shaped by Catton in the 1950s and 1960s. Stephen Sears wrote at one point that he thought all of the talk about the explosion, Ken Burns and all the other things about the Civil War in the 90s, Catton is lurking in the background as one of the preconditions, I would say, for much of what happened in the late 1980s and early 1990s, explosion of the whole battlefield preservation movement. all
That's a
of
good-
that.
yeah.
I think Catton is critical to that. If you take away all of Catton's works, there's not another series from the centennial years that is, you can say, oh, that's the book from the centennial years that brought in untold new readers. I can't name a single book from the centennial years that did that. Maybe you can come up with one, but I don't know what I would, that isn't associated with Catton in any way.
Right. I agree. I mean, Morant for me, 1956 and 69 were the two editions of his book.
Yep.
I see Max is coming back on screen.
I see Max there. That's
Just
that's
the
an
right-
indication we're about to have a shift in focus here.
But thanks, Gary.
Well,
That was a great
This
conversation.
was fun.
Fantastic conversation.
I'm going to take
And,
a sip now.
anyway, there's been a lot of activity in the Q&A boxes. I'm sure you've noticed. Some of it is there's a lot of people who are curious about some of the same things. I think you've addressed a lot of the questions that have come up, in the course of your conversation. But I'm glad that you mentioned Ken Burns in that last pass, because many people, and I'll just mention some of them, Thomas Hecht from Minneapolis, Minnesota, Alec Rogers from Bethesda, Maryland, Robert Storms from Midland Park, New Jersey, Brian Abel Reagan, hi Brian, from St. Louis, Missouri, and William Harris from Shippensburg, Pennsylvania, all ask, and there are others as well, how does Bruce Catton compare to Shelby Foote as a historian of the Civil War? I mean, what's your take on their different approaches and their aims and their effects?
Well, I'll take a quick one. I mean, I think Shelby Foote was also a very good writer, a novelist who wrote three big, very big, much larger than Catton's books, his trilogy on the Civil War. I think for my personal taste, Catton is a better writer than Foote, although Foote was certainly a good writer. Foote definitely has his heart, and he says so in one of his volumes. I mean, he's a Mississippian, and white Southerners were his people, and he wrote sort of with great empathy for the Confederate war effort in his trilogy. I think that he is more military than Catton in some ways. I think he has more focus on military things, although he also devotes attention to politics and other things as well. If I could only have one of them on my shelves, and I have both, I would have Catton.
I mean, I would agree that it's very hard to get past the John Singleton Mosby fascination and all of that. But I think it's interesting, if there is a continuum here, we both agree that without Catton, there's no Burns. Without Burns, there's no efflorescence in Shelby Foote, because
absolutely
it
none.
exploded for Shelby Foote after that.
And
also, Shelby Foote used no source notes. I mean, he made a thing of not listing his sources.
That's right. And Foote's books did not sell that well until he was on. I mean, they weren't disasters, but as Harold said, what made Foote so prominent among people who are interested in the Civil War is Ken Burns, is the fact that he's the leading talking head on Ken Burns. His books had not sold nearly as many copies as Catton's did until he was on Ken Burns.
Thanks. You've talked a lot about, the 70 years since the books were written and the scholarship since then, but there's a lot of interest in that question. Alec Rogers asks, is there any part of Catton's trilogy you would say we know now that was wrong, or that you'd caution about? There are a lot of people who are curious about that. William Price of Minneapolis says, has there been more recent research that might have changed some of Catton's conclusions? And then there's a similar question from David Borsakowski of Burlington, Vermont. Given the author's approach and his time and place in the middle of the 20th century, what do you think he might write today as an epilogue to his trilogy?
Well, I think he would do more. I think he would do more with issues relating to slavery and emancipation if he were doing it now. I mean, Catton would have fallen into, if we were labeling people of his time, he was a Democrat. He was a New Deal Democrat. He certainly would have been considered a liberal at the time. And I think that he was sort of ahead of the curve in some ways in terms of how he dealt with black soldiers. As Harold said, he's the first one who really wrote about, first white scholar to really write about black soldiers in anything like a serious way here. But for readers who, I would just tell readers that who are coming to these books, which I think are well worth coming back to, or I wouldn't have had any part of it. They're not going to, these are not books that are just like books that are written now. So there will be things missing in them that would be present in books now. There would be different emphases, but I think that in some ways he simply anticipated when he says it's not mainly a military event, it's a political event. That's how most academics would talk about it now, that it's, I mean, you really have to consider the politics of it more than the military part. The military is working out the political problems. He's way ahead of the curve there.
Harold,
I don't mean to take all the oxygen, Harold.
No, I mean, it's not a new construct that war is politics, that
No.
can't be settled with an election, but it was, yes, it wasn't written about in the war. And when I was the age when I was reading Catton for the first time in the early 60s, I didn't know anything about black soldiers. We were never taught that
Nothing.
in school. And
Nothing.
course,
I mean,
nothing.
Crickets.
So it was revolutionary.
There's
And
another.
Max, let me
Please.
very quickly say
Yeah.
too, that with all his attention and sort of admiration for Union soldiers, he has very clear eye. He says only about a third of them were really, I mean, he said the army, that 1/3 of the army is really what did most of the fighting, kept it together, really won the war. A third tried every way they could to avoid everything, and a third just kind of did what they needed to do and went along. I mean, he doesn't look at Union soldiers through rose-colored glasses at all. He has I think a very honest and sort of blunt view of Union soldiers in these books. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yes. Well, many other questions relate not so much to Catton's view of the Union soldiers as to his view of the South and Southern soldiers. There's a question just came through from Peter Sawatchka Dalton. What was Catton's view on the myth of the lost cause, and what influence does that have on the Army of the Potomac? And there are many other questions like that. Douglas Benetti of Shingle Springs, California, was Catton a supporter of the lost cause? David Lightfoot of Santa Rosa, how does Catton's interpretation deal with the lost cause narrative that was popular at the time? And then kind of from the other side of that question, Brendan Corey, Brendan Corey of South Burlington, Vermont says, typically when we discuss the events of the Civil War, I feel the focus is on the Union as the protagonist and Confederacy as the antagonist. This leaves me wondering just how best should we teach and discuss both sides, and specifically how the Confederacy should be taught and discussed. So there are many questions about, I mean, I think what's being responded to is Catton's tragic sense of the war, and his, as Ken Burns has too, I mean, his feeling for the Southern soldiers, despite feeling that their cause was wrong. So I guess I think that's where the questions are coming from. Like how does Catton's work fit into that, and to what feels now to some people, I would say, a kind of a morally suspect sympathy for some on the Southern side. I guess that's the way to ask it.
Yeah, well, we love clear-cut heroes and villains now in our view of the past. Keep it as simple as possible. Give me the 30-second version of what the past is like. We've become a society, I think, that doesn't like complexity in history. And if you like history, you better get used to complexity, because that is what it's filled with. Catton cannot by any stretch, I think, be called a lost cause. He's not a lost cause person. He wouldn't have framed it this way. The memory studies lay far in the future at the time that Catton wrote, and people didn't really think in those terms or write in those terms in the late 1940s and early 1950s. There are reconciliationist elements to what he writes. He doesn't demonize Confederates. He doesn't stop every few pages to say slavery was awful, the Confederacy was wrong, every soldier who fought for the Confederacy was there. I mean, he does not do that. That's not what he's up to. He does say that the Army of the Potomac accomplished a great deal, that the United States won the war, and by doing so, it saved the nation, but it left undone, he says, the hard work of what's going to happen to emancipated people. He's well aware of that. He says that in this trilogy on the most famous Union Army. So I think that, again, I would caution people against going back to these books and trying to find an approach that is the kind of approach that someone might follow now. That's just, I don't think that's the way that Catton approached, that he came to this. But you would find elements of reconciliation in these books, no question about it. And much of the Union cause, and a clear appreciation that emancipation is central by the end of the war, and that although the nation solves the question of whether there'll be slavery, they do not solve the question of how are the freed people going to be treated going forward.
Yes.
But I do think, I mean, the book is, this is early 60s, it's pre-civil rights movement when he's getting his act together here. And yet there is a sense of unfinished work through the book. And there, I think, through the books, and I think there is an acknowledgement that sectional reconciliation has to be accompanied by racial reconciliation, even if he doesn't summon, historian David Blight's brilliant phraseology to get there. You have the sense that that it's a two-pronged approach that will be required to complete unfinished work.
Yeah.
These books came out before Brown versus Board of Education. These books are really pre key part of the civil rights movement. I mean, it's a long time ago. It's just before a very great deal happened in the 1950s. These books came out. So I think when you situate them that way, I think that Catton actually comes out pretty well in how he deals with these themes.
Well said. But I would also add, I mean, I quoted the comment that he made at the Memorial Day speech that, tragedy is not in the key of American culture. So, I mean, it's not only a matter of that, although it clearly is a matter of that. It's also a matter of the fact that it's always hard for people to balance judgment and compassion, or whatever you want to call it, judgment and understanding and sympathy. And I mean, I think even in, Catton's time, it was probably difficult, for readers to do that, as he acknowledges. I guess we only have time for one more question. So I'll just say that DeBerry Edward of Dade City, this is a time machine question. I'll just warn you in advance. DeBerry Edward of Dade City, Florida says, what did the average Union soldier fight for? To abolish slavery, to preserve the Union, to have an adventure, peer pressure, other reasons. And I'll just say that, we talked about the fact that Catton met Civil War veterans in his youth, which is an experience that, is unavailable, obviously, to your generation of historians. But since technology is improving all the time, I guess I'll ask that when you have a chance to talk with the men who fought in the Union Army, what will you ask them?
You've packed a lot in there. Final question.
Well, I guess the question is, what, Catton tries to give us the interior view of the Union soldier. And I guess the question is, it will always remain a mystery. And I guess, the question is for you as readers and historians, what would you like to know?
Well, I mean, I don't think in my own view, and Harold can disagree with this if he likes, in my own view, I don't think there's any doubt that for most of the loyal white citizenry, and the North was 98.8% white, according to the 1860 census. So it's the North is white. Even with the border states, the 4 loyal border states, it's more than 95% white. For the very large majority of those people, the overriding purpose of the war was to restore the Union, and the Republic bequeathed to the people of that time by the founding generation. I think as the war, and 45% of those people were Democrats, roughly. None of the Democrats thought emancipation was a good thing, really, or very few of them did. But I think even many Democrats by the end of the war accepted emancipation as a necessary tool to defeat the Confederacy. Doesn't mean you have to separate attitudes toward Black people and attitudes toward emancipation. So I think more and more people came on board with the idea of emancipations being necessary. But I think first to last, most people in the loyal states would have said the most important thing we have to do is restore the Union. And as it went along, it's going to be a Union without slavery, but restoring the Union would have been number one.
Yes.
And Gary has written brilliantly about this in the Union War. And I would just add my own nuance to it is that as more and more of these Northern white soldiers saw slavery for themselves, and as they saw Black troops fighting heroically and on equal status, they came around to thinking a bit philanthropically about emancipation as well. But it's hard to conceive, as Gary has written, hard to conceive of the Union as being something worth fighting for, because it sounds like to us, like, the teachers union and the steelworkers, and which evokes controversy today. But it's the thing that makes it understandable is that we're fighting against the Northern soldiers. We're fighting against insurrectionists who would not accept the results of a legitimate presidential election. And I think framing
that could never happen again, though.
It could never happen again, but I think it makes it right.
Well, and they had a very exceptionalist view of the United States, and they were right. They said that the Western world is what matters to them. We're the only place in the Western world where citizens can vote, and that meant white men. It's a limited franchise in our perspective, but a breathtakingly broad one in theirs. It's the only place where that's true, and the only place where you aren't doomed to be what your father was. There's a chance for economic advancement and changing classes, as we might put it. That's not anywhere else. It's only here. And if we allow the rebels to destroy this work of the founders just because they didn't like who was elected president, then maybe people aren't capable of self-government. Maybe the Europeans are right. They're moving away from democracy after the 1840s failed revolutions. Maybe they're right and we're wrong. If we don't win this war, it not only has implications for the United States, it has implications for small d democracy in the Western world. And so there's a lot riding on this from their perspective.
The good news is that Gary has clearly read not only Catton, but Lincoln, because that's the best paraphrase of the arguments for defending the Union that I've heard in a long time. And it's Gary by way of Lincoln. Perfect.
By way of Lincoln. Lincoln didn't need to teach the loyal population of why Union was important. He just explained it better than most other people would in fewer words. He didn't go at them with a didactic purpose, but really more an affirming purpose. Of course, this is what we're for. As late as his last message to Congress in 1864, last annual message to Congress, he said the overriding goal of this war is union, and emancipation is one of the necessary tools to achieve it. Lincoln wanted to kill slavery, but he has a broader public he's trying to keep on board with the war, and that's how he explained it to them.
Right. Okay, I think we have to leave it there, but thank you. No, it's a good place to start to end, I think. Thank you both very much for a really fascinating conversation. Wonderful. You've been listening to Gary Gallagher and Harold Holzer discuss Bruce Catton's Army of the Potomac Trilogy, restored to print, and a one-volume edition edited by Gary Gallagher and the Library of America, series number 359 in the series. Please join us for more online events from Library of America. On February 15th, it's Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, with Pulitzer Prize-winning Douglass biographer David Blight, an exploration of the genius of the extraordinary man who escaped slavery to become one of the greatest orators and writers in American history. On March 14, we mark Women's History Month with Back to the Future is Female, a conversation about the science fiction writers who broke the genre's gender barrier and the visionary futures they imagined. And in April, acclaimed short story writers Tobias Wolff and Nicole Krauss join LOA Live for a masterclass in one of Bernard Malamud's greatest stories with Malamud's biographer, Philip Davis. Details about these and other events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about the Catton, Frederick Douglass, Malamud, and women's science fiction volumes, and links to purchase those and other editions of Great American Writing. You'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. Thanks so much again to Gary Gallagher and Harold Holzer. Have a wonderful evening.